we're going to lean into the topic of grief this morning. I just sense from the Lord that, this is so applicable to the story of Joseph, as we'll see. But oh my goodness, this is such an important topic for the church, for the bride of Christ. And I am praying that the Lord would somehow use my insufficiencies to teach His word today in a way that we really need to hear Him today. Amen? There's an old story that's a true story. It has to do with the cattle and the buffalo. Maybe some of you have probably heard this before. I stole it from a friend. But the way this story goes is that actually out west, where the Rocky Mountains are, the storms are coming over the mountains, and the nature of the cattle and the nature of the buffalo are very different. And what the cattle tend to do is they're fear-driven, and so as they see a storm that's coming over the Rocky Mountains and approaching them, they think we must run. And the problem is that as they're running, the storm catches up to them, and it actually lengthens the amount of time they're in the storm, because as they're trying to run from the storm, they suddenly are running with the storm. But the buffalo are very different. The buffalo are not fear-driven, right? There's the flight or fight. The buffalo are not the ones that are going to fly away. They're the ones that want to fight. And as they see this aggressive storm coming over the mountains towards them, they charge the storm in an attack mode. And because they face the storm and run right to it and run right through it, that storm passes over them quickly. Does that make sense? And I think that's my hope for us this morning. The truth is that grief is a gift, and we're going to talk a lot more about that this morning. But I fear that many of us, our natural disposition is to run away from grief. And because we run away from grief, we endure it so much more longer than God's intention for us to in the first place. But would we this morning be like the buffalo? Would we pay attention to what the Lord's doing in this house? Would we pay attention to the motives of our hearts and the way that the Lord might want to meet us and teach us, and by His grace heal us by leaning in, not running from? 2 weeks ago, we took last week a break from our series on the story of Joseph. But just to kind of bring you back into where we are in this story, Joseph had just stood before the mighty Pharaoh. And we have seen a journey of this young man. But Joseph finally did it. He passed the ultimate test by letting God be his advocate in what was seemingly an impossible situation to be in. That he would go from the prison to the palace, not by anything that he did, but what God would do for him. But he did submit and surrender to the process of the Lord. And because of this, because Joseph didn't advocate for himself, because he didn't convince Pharaoh into a high and lofty position for himself, God went ahead and did it for him, and He blessed him in more ways than he could imagine. And to be frank with you, this is sort of where we think that the story would end. Don't you think? That it ends on a good note, that Joseph stood the test of time. He endured betrayal, false accusation, unfair imprisonment, and he stands before the Pharaoh not representing himself, but representing the Lord. And you think storybook ending right there. But that's not the case. Joseph probably even thought that this is the end of the story. But God does not settle. You never see that in Scripture. You will not see that in your life. You will not see a God that goes, you know what? You're 60% there. That's good enough for me. Let's just let you be that. No, the Lord is so jealous for you, and He loves you so much that He will not settle with you. And as we pick back up in this story, Joseph, now 30 years old, is given by Pharaoh himself a new name, a new wife, and in many ways a new life. He's now educated in the Egyptian culture, right? Remember that this was a Hebrew man, an Israelite sold into Egypt, but now he's been educated and he is very fluent in the ways of the Egyptian. And just as Joseph prophesied in that dream interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, that there would be 7 years of fruitfulness, and the word tells us that there was so much grain produced that Joseph stopped counting it. In fact, the word compares it to the sand of the seas. Imagine that much grain. And the word tells us that during this time, Joseph had 2 sons. And this is going to matter, trust me. Because it's interesting The first name that he gives his son is Manasseh, which is derived from the Hebrew word to forget. Chapter 41 of verse 51 says that Joseph named his son Manasseh, forget, because God has made me forget all of my trouble of my father's household. It's the first time in 13 years that we hear Joseph's recollection of his family. The second name of his second child is Ephraim, which is derived from the Hebrew word fruitful. And it says this, that it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. So what we can take away from this, right, as theologians here, is that in this season, the Bible is abundantly clear. Joseph was forgetful of his past, and he was fruitful in his present. But I'm here to tell you today that fruitfulness does not equal forgetfulness. And we're going to see this play out a little bit in Joseph's life here. But what do I mean by that? That fruitfulness does not equal forgetfulness. Well, first, Joseph might have moved on, but his heart clearly did not move on. He named his first son Forget as a declaration that he has forgotten about his past, but what his mouth declared, his heart seemed to ignore. In other words, what I'm trying to tell you this morning is that no matter how good or how bad life gets, God still wants to deal with the issues of the heart. Amen. And the hidden things of the heart will always eventually come to the surface. They will be exposed. Think about it. Adam hid, Jonah ran, and Peter fished. But all their problems didn't just go away. And they were going to have to deal with them. Why? Because God does not settle. Sometimes we, if we are not careful, and I believe some of you will resonate with this, we believe the lie that if we have the fruit, then surely we'll forget. And we think to ourselves, if I just move to a different city, a job, a different church, you name it, our problems would suddenly disappear. Poof. Or if we finally had that promotion, that girlfriend or that husband, that vacation, everything would get better. And I'm here to tell you that maybe for a time it does, but your problems do not just disappear. If things finally started to go our way, the wounds that we've experienced would actually heal. And as much as we'd love to believe and convince ourselves in make-believe land that that's how life works, we will learn, and maybe some of us resonate, we've already learned and continue to learn, that our problems cannot be forgotten, they must be faced. Because fruitfulness does not equal forgetfulness. Back to the story. Joseph finally had that good new life that he was probably dreaming about in prison. He has a loving wife, healthy children, a promising job. He's the number 2 man in Egypt. I mean, imagine. And he probably thought that his days of betrayals and imprisonments and hardships were over, but God doesn't settle. Suddenly, those 7 years of fruitfulness pass in the blink of an eye. I imagine they probably went by very quickly because life seems to move a little faster, right? When everything's going just fine. And then began those 7 years of famine. Verse 57 tells us that not just in Egypt, but all of the world would come to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was so severe. And then the Bible, it gives us a scene change. The camera starts to shift from the Egyptian pyramids all the way to the land of Canaan. And for the first time in 13 years, we get a glimpse of Joseph's father and his brothers. You start to see the Lord here. You start to think, this story could have ended, and Joseph, he could have just moved on. He's trying his best to forget about his past, but the Lord cares deeply about his heart. And the word shows us that in the land of Canaan there is a great famine. And Jacob, his father, is with all of his brothers, and he tells his sons to go to Egypt so that they will not die amidst the famine. So they do. Picking up in chapter 42 of verse 6, the word says that now Joseph was the governor of the land. You just see what the Lord's doing here. And the person who sold grain to all of the people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived and they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground, as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger, and he spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked them. A couple points from this. First of all, Joseph's brothers unknowingly bow down before him. Does that sound familiar at all? I know that it's been a month and a half, but if we go all the way back to 17-year-old Joseph, who had that very first dream and what happened in that dream, but his brothers would bow down before him. Long time ago, so much has changed, but God doesn't forget and God is faithful. And I wonder if it occurred to Joseph in that moment exactly what was happening. I'm going to go on a limb and say I don't think so. Because here's what I think. I think Joseph, likely in shock, went into grief. I think that he began to grieve his past that he tried to forget and realized that the past has caught up to him. And just imagine being in Joseph's shoes for just a moment. Life is really good. You wear nice Egyptian robes. You're wearing Pharaoh's ring. You've got headgear. You've got an amazing wife. You've got beautiful children. You have moved on and you have moved forward. And lo and behold, here comes those brothers that betrayed you. And they see this high authority Egyptian and they fall to their knees bowing down before him. But Joseph, likely in shock, I believe is hit with grief. What is grief? It is a deep, soul-level sadness, especially at the death of someone or the loss of something dear. And grief, let me tell you, when it comes, it is an essential expression of our emotions. I'm going to say that one more time. It's so important to understand. Grief, when it comes, is an essential expression of our emotions. And it's why, as the church, we need to be careful to not spiritually bypass hard topics like grief. Let me just share a quick story with you. You're thinking, what is spiritual bypassing? And I'll say more about it. But my in-laws are here, and they were just asking me, actually, about the scar that I have on my leg. And some of you have seen it. It's a pretty gnarly scar. And the way that I got it, long story short here, is that when I was maybe 10 or 11 years old, my parents, I'm a pastor's kid, so I have no sympathy for Maverick because I've been there and done that, and he's going to be just fine, let me tell you. Now, being a Broncos fan is a different story. I'll be praying for him, trust me. But my parents are having this church event, and I'm hanging out in the backyard, and there's a bunch of little kids on our trampoline, and we had one of those trampolines with the net around it. Maybe you're familiar. And as I'm just actually outside the trampoline, but I'm leaning on the net, these little ones come and surprise me, and they push me off the trampoline. Well, I've got some spidey senses, you know, and I leap to the nearby pole, and I swing down it thinking that I've avoided a catastrophic fall, only to discover that I didn't avoid a catastrophic injury. There was a bolt sticking out on the trampoline. It stabbed into my leg and sliced me right open. So as an 11-year-old boy, I start weeping like a baby because I'm scared out of my mind. Blood is everywhere. My leg shouldn't be open to the point that I can almost see my bone, let me tell you. Okay? Sorry for those that aren't good with blood. I'm not. Just pretend it's food dye or something like that, okay? Imagination. So I get 10 staples. We call it a day. It's going to heal beautifully. It's going to be a very insignificant scar, the doctor tells me. Of course, as an 11-year-old, I was a little disappointed to hear that part. Like, the scar is everything. But don't worry. I figured out a way to make it very memorable. My parents were getting me into soccer camp. And in order to get into soccer camp, I needed to get my staples out early on my leg. So we get the staples out early. I play for the week in soccer. It's great. And then just because I'm a curious 11-year-old, I'm just bored one day, probably a Saturday, and I think to myself, this scar is kind of healing nicely. I wonder if I can still look through my leg a little bit and like look into it. So sorry. So as an 11-year-old curious boy, okay, everybody, are we okay? I'm the kind of guy that faints when I see blood, so I don't want to hear it. I look, and my leg splits back open. I'll never forget the noise. Like that sound. Yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry. Okay, this is not going the way I thought it would. Don't throw tomatoes yet. Hold on. I'm going somewhere with this. My dad, who's a really good dad, okay? You don't have to call Child Protective Services. At this point, it's too late anyways. But I turned out okay. I promise you he's a good dad. And dads or moms, you might resonate with this. My dad was so angry at me because 2 weeks ago I was in the hospital and the bill was hefty. And he thought, we're not going back. We're going to put Band-Aids on that sucker. And however it heals, it heals. And that's how I got a gnarly scar on my leg. What's my point with all of those gruesome details? My point is my leg healed, but it didn't heal the way that it was supposed to. I actually have in some parts of it nerve damage in it. I'm totally fine. It's a good leg. It can still do everything I need it to do. I'm like, I fall all of a sudden. I'm like, oh no, it's catching up to me. But we bypassed what we needed to do and it didn't heal properly. And sometimes what we do, if we're not careful, is we want to spiritually bypass things that are hard and we just expect them to get better and they don't heal properly. See what I got? We got where we need to get, right? It was worth it. And my point is, especially in the place of grief, we cannot do that. Your soul cannot afford you to spiritually bypass grief. One of the hardest reasons that we do this is because if we're honest, it's inconvenient and uncomfortable to sit in our grief or let alone invite people into it. But that is why the church exists. To enjoy the highlights and rejoice with those who rejoice. But more times than not, we become the church when we weep with those who weep. When we're willing to sit with each other in hardship and not just so easily spiritually bypass around it. And we need to be careful to not resist contexts where suffering or grief or struggle exist. Because, beloved, I am telling you, we will not heal properly if we do that. Not only can grief be good, grief is godly. And Jesus so beautifully exemplified this to us in his life on earth. There's this famous scene, you're familiar with it, you probably know where I'm going, where Jesus' dear friend Lazarus has died, and his dear friends Mary and Martha have beckoned Jesus to come into their town and to heal and to save Lazarus before he could die. Jesus, clearly knowing, he tells his disciples and he tells others that this is going to be for the glory of God. Jesus, fully aware that he is going to resurrect Lazarus after being dead for 3 days. Okay? But he could have done it with 3 years too, let's be honest. So what happens? But Jesus stands before a mourning Martha and a mourning Mary, and Jesus begins to grieve. The word actually says that Jesus wept. It is the shortest verse in the Bible, and it is the easiest to memorize, okay? Why did Jesus grieve? Because Jesus understood that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Jesus wasn't grieving, I believe, because of Lazarus. Jesus was grieving because of the reality of sin and brokenness in this world. This was never the design of God, and Jesus knew that as he is God, and Jesus was grieving at this reality. What did he do in this moment? He allowed himself to feel the pain of his heart. So important. He didn't distract himself from it. He didn't numb himself from the pain. He did not refuse himself from it. He did not push it down and bottle it up. Jesus wept. Jesus experienced the full range of his emotions in this moment because he grieved the reality of sin. And he accepted what he felt, and he worshiped the Father with it. When we grieve, we are expressing the deep feelings of emotion that we are feeling. And when we let these emotions out, we are experiencing steps of healing. I'm telling you that weeping is an experience that you might have in a state of grief. And weeping does something to the soul that I don't even quite understand. But the few times I've ever wept in my life, it has been some of the holiest and most healing experiences of my life. What I've realized is that in many ways, weeping, it actually pacifies our soul. What do I mean by pacify? The word pacify means to soothe anger or uncomfortability. And there's something about the state of weeping, allowing yourself to feel the brokenness, to feel the heartache, to feel the sadness, to feel the anger. And you invite the Lord into that place. You don't run from it. I believe Joseph was grieving when his brothers showed up on his doorstep 13 years later. Verse 7 tells us that as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and he spoke harshly to them. Joseph was angry. He was not happy. These emotions caught up to him, and his initial response was anger. And honestly, rightfully so. Here's my third point. Just because you're angry doesn't mean you're sinning. Some of you need to hear that. Ephesians 4:26 tells us that in your anger, do not sin. Or another way to look at that verse is to be angry, but to do not sin. And what I'm trying to tell you is that anger is not necessarily wrong. It can be right. We often experience anger when we have felt wronged by someone. Shouldn't we be angry because of this, though? If you have been wronged by somebody, it might actually be a healthy reaction to be angry about it. Let me ask you a different question. Is it wrong that Joseph sees his brothers who sold him into slavery 13 years ago, and the moment he sees them, he's angry with them? I don't think so. And I don't think the Lord is disappointed or disapproving of Joseph's anger. I'm going to say more about that. Actually, I want to quote a friend and an author of our church, funny enough, Dave Wernley here. But this is in Dave's new book, and I really love this quote because I think it helps give us an understanding of how anger can be a healthy tool in the spiritual discipline of our soul. And he says this, that being angry about evil or even wrongdoing done to you is a healthy part of forgiveness. That forgiveness is key. Just like anger is one of the phases of grief, it is a legitimate phase of the forgiveness process. We cannot forgive what we do not acknowledge as wrong. If something heinous or wrong was done to us, then we should be angry about it. Let me tell you what doesn't work. Just blindly forgiving people, but never actually forgiving them. Because what you've done is you've not only wronged yourself, but you have wronged them. You have given them the impression that they are forgiven, and if they are not, then that needs to be clear. Do you understand what I'm saying here? What I like about this is that, in essence, what it is saying is that we cannot forgive or we cannot grow in the progress of our healing journey if we do not rightfully acknowledge the wrong that was done to us in the first place. You must be aware of how you might have felt wronged, and I think anger might be a natural reaction to that. The question that we need to ask ourselves, to hold ourselves accountable, I hope you hear me, when it comes to anger, is my anger an aid in processing the emotions of my heart, or is my anger a stumbling block imprisoning the emotions of my heart? We have got to hold ourselves accountable. Rage is no excuse. It doesn't matter how angry you get. How are you stewarding the anger that you feel? In many ways, anger can be the doorway to the rest of our emotions. And we're leaning in a bit to anger. And I'm going to really shine some light on some of this. And I know this is a lot of head knowledge, but I'm praying that you can really hear this and receive this, because I do believe that this is incredibly important for us as believers and how we steward our emotions. In many ways, anger can be the doorway to the rest of our emotions. And here's why. Because anger is what science would classify as a secondary emotion, meaning it typically arises as a response to other primary emotions like fear or sadness. The idea is that there's usually another feeling underneath that anger that we are typically reacting to. Here's just a few examples to help you. First of all, you might experience fear. In a moment, something might have happened and you might feel afraid, and your first experience and reaction to that fear might actually be anger. But then soon after, you might realize that the root of your anger is in the fear that you felt. That's why there's times something might scare you, and you might rise up and react in anger to it. But if you're not diligent or you're not willing to press into the deeper places of emotion, it just stays at anger. But it's important to recognize, to go deeper and to recognize it's fear. Why am I afraid? What is this in me that's causing me to be afraid of this? Here's maybe a little bit more of an applicable example. You might experience sadness. And when you experience this, your reaction might be to be angry first. But then you realize that your root of anger was actually sadness due to hurt. But there's one more reason I believe that anger is typically the doorway to our emotions. And it's because it's easier and it feels safer to be angry than vulnerable. In other words, anger can be a defense mechanism to protect ourselves from being vulnerable. But it is so important that we give ourselves permission with safe people to be vulnerable. So what I'm trying to tell you is that anger isn't wrong, but staying angry is very wrong. This is the second part of Ephesians 4. Paul continues this. Be angry, but do not sin. And then he goes on to say, do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Think about that. What Paul is getting at is that you are not to fester in your anger. And think about this. When you stay in anger, you lose control. And when you lose control, you're not losing control, you're giving it away. And that's to the devil. That's why Paul is saying, when you don't properly digest the anger that you experience, you give Satan a foothold in your life, and he will steal, kill, and destroy you in every way possible. So what do we do? It begs the question with anger, right? We want to be good stewards of our emotions. You're telling me that anger is not necessarily wrong, so long as I don't let it get the best of me. Here's what I think we do. We either give it to God in the place of surrender, or we bring it before our neighbor that we are angry with and we work it out. Those are your two options. I'm not saying that it has to be immediately done. I think that's where accountability is incredibly important, to have safe people that you're processing with. But beloved, there comes a time where anger has to be a finish line, and you must transition, and you must look deeper within than just these doorways of anger. And we either go to the Lord and say, God, I'm giving this to you, heal me, or you go to the one that you're angry with and you sort it out. But what we do not do as Christians, we do not passively hide it away and harbor offense against another that we are angry with. If we choose to do that, then we are in sin. And you need to hear that. And that's not God's will for our lives, to be plagued in sin, prisoners of sin. But remember this, that where there is anger, there is often something deeper at work in the heart. And we do see this in Joseph. As Joseph is confronting his brothers, he accuses them as spies. Their response in verse 10, "No, my lord," they answered, "your servants have come to just buy food. We are all sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies." "No," he said to them, "you have come here to see where our land is unprotected." Imagine how painful that must have felt for Joseph to hear his betraying brothers tell him to his face, not even knowing it, that they're honest men. A grieving Joseph then decides that he will test his brothers. All but one of them is to remain in the land as prisoners, and that one is to return home and bring back their youngest son to prove their testimony. Now remember, Benjamin, the youngest son of Jacob's, is Joseph's legitimate brother. And so I think in Joseph's heart, he wants to know, is Benjamin okay? Is my brother, my true blood brother, is he okay? Or has he been wronged by them as well? And then Joseph goes on to imprison all of his brothers for 3 days. What I believe is happening here, I think Joseph is clearly grieving, and I believe he buys himself 3 days. I think he's out of sorts, and he doesn't really know what to do, and he's clearly angry and speaking harshly to his brothers. And I think there's some wisdom here. That in your anger, don't just sin. In your anger, typically don't respond. In your anger, take a step back, seek counsel, seek God, and slow down a little bit. And those 3 days clearly change Joseph's heart even a little bit. Because the word says that Joseph, 3 days later, as he lets his brothers out of prison, he changes his mind. He decides that only one of his brothers will now remain in prison and the rest can go to the land. They can take food with them. They can feed their people. But if they want to free that one brother in prison, they still have to bring their youngest brother back and prove their testimony. And then it gets very interesting because Joseph overhears a conversation that he's not supposed to overhear. Mind you that this is Joseph, who's an Egyptian in the eyes of his brothers. He's got the look. He speaks fluent Egyptian. They have no idea that he can understand their Hebrew words. And so he's actually been using an interpreter the entire time he's been talking to them. And so all of a sudden, we pick up in verse 21. It gets very interesting here. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother." You cannot make this up. "We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but he would not listen, and that is why this distress has come upon us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you would not listen, and now we must account for his blood that is on us." Joseph sitting there, listening to all of this. And finally, Joseph's emotions well up to the point that he cannot control himself any longer. He must remove himself physically from their presence, and he weeps. That's my last point. I'll invite the worship team up. Just because you are sad does not mean you are a bad Christian. See, following Jesus does not mean that every day is going to be full of rainbows and butterflies. We've talked about that. We know that. And I'm here to tell you that I have a great comfort in my Savior who knew this better than anybody. Jesus knew very well that the life that we choose in following him would not be easy. In fact, in his final week with his disciples before he would go to the cross, he prepares them for what is to come, found in John 16. And he says that he is to leave them, the world is to persecute them, and the Spirit of God would be with them. And Jesus does not mince words. He does not sugarcoat it. He tells us in verse 20, "Very truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices." But then he goes on to say this, "You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy." Jesus actually expects the Christian to grieve. He fully expects us to be aware of our wrongdoings, our woundings, the unresolved conflicts of our heart, and he invites us to consider how grief can be worship. What I'm trying to tell you is that it is okay to be angry, but we are not to sin in our anger. It is okay to be sad, but we do not allow sadness to become what it was never meant to be. Sadness should never lead you to despair. It should lead you to Jesus. And I need you to hear this, because in this world, sadness, it's like quicksand. And once you get in, it is so easy to stay in and let it take you down with it. And this is not the design of God for the human heart. Sadness is not something that we are somehow bad or sinful or broken Christians if we experience. But sadness is something that the Lord wants to meet us in and love us through. Psalm 34:8 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit." Some of us, you need to memorize this. You need to tattoo this on your heart, because when you experience sadness, this is what you need to clothe yourself in. In our sadness, we must look for God. Not for him to simply fix it, but to be aware that he is there in the midst of it. And we must realize that he does not leave us in these sad places of despair. So I love the last verse in John 16. Jesus is given this very hard teaching to his disciples. I'm going to be leaving you. I'm going to be crucified. You're going to watch me die. And the world is going to hate you. And they're going to rejoice as you suffer. But then Jesus closes this thing out. Says, but here's the good news. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm going to give you my Spirit. And my Spirit is going to live within you. Which is remarkable. And he goes on to say, John 16:33, "In this world you will have trouble. You will have tribulation. You will experience sadness. You will experience hardship." But he goes on to say, "Take heart, because I have overcome the world." I pray you hear me when I say this. Emotions are important, but they are not our God. Emotions can be strong. They are not your Savior. They have a seat at the table, but they do not run the meeting. And I imagine that this is what life looked like for Joseph. That in those 3 days he was grieving his brothers, what they had done to him, the wrong and the betrayal and the audacity to call themselves honest men. But the beauty in all of this is that Joseph realized that even though his heart was still broken, God could heal it. Time helps, but I'm telling you, time does not heal all wounds. Only God can do that, and He usually does through the gift of grieving. Let's pray together.